Hello, good evening everyone. Thanks for coming. And for those of you here at the museum, thank you for making the trip. For those of you zooming in, thank you very much for tuning in. I'm Luke Gates-Millardo, the Director of Exhibits and Learning here at Maine Maritime Museum, and I'm honored to welcome Osihkiyol Crofton-Macdonald for his presentation on the Watertown Treaty of 1776, a Wabanaki Perspective. Zeke is a Wolastoqey person from the Houlton Band of Maliseets in Oromocto First Nation in New Brunswick. He spent his life advocating for Native rights in the United States and Canada and is currently serving as the tribal ambassador for the Houlton Band of Maliseets in Maine. He also serves as the president of the Wabanaki Alliance and as a tribal commissioner for the Houlton Band on the Maine Indian Tribal State Commission. He is currently working on a master's thesis on Wabanaki Treaty History at the University of New Brunswick. Zeke's research provides crucial context to events surrounding this nation's history. For too long, popular historiographers have presented a singular perspective on the country's foundations, neglecting events and viewpoints that can reshape a colonial-centric national narrative. To achieve a more complete understanding of this region, it is imperative that we listen to the Wabanaki perspective. Tonight, we gather on Wabanaki homeland to do just that, to listen deeply, to learn about the complexities of Wabanaki diplomacy, the pursuit of sovereignty, and the enduring importance of this treaty. We hope this event sparks new questions, new insights, and a deeper appreciation for the foundational role of Indigenous nations in this region's identity. I'd like to thank Meadow Dibble and Atlantic Black Box for connecting us with Zeke, for co-hosting this event, and for being powerful institutional partners over the past couple years. And I'd also like to thank the wonderful team at Patent Free Library, right in Bath, who is also co-hosting this event and whose partnership has made the talk possible, and Maine State Library, whose Revolutionary Maine Commemoration Grant funded this event. Finally, especially Zeke, thank you very much for being here. Now, everyone, please join me in offering a warm welcome to Zeke Crofton-Macdonald.
Quite nearly with Zeke Crofton-Macdonald, Wolastoqey and Metaksonekiyik, Welamukotuk. Hello everyone, my name is Zeke Crofton-Macdonald. Can you hear me? Should I get closer? Louder. Okay, maybe right here? Okay. My name is Zeke Crofton-Macdonald. I'm a Wolastoqey person from the Houlton Band of Maliseets Indians and Oromocto First Nation in New Brunswick, Canada. Thank you for the invitation to speak today. Thank you to Meadow, Luke, Atlantic Black Box, and the Maine Maritime Museum. And thank you to everyone who chose to join us today. I was invited to speak on the Watertown Treaty of 1776. I am a historian by training. I attended the University of Maine for my undergrad, where I majored in history, and attended the University of New Brunswick for graduate school, where I continued to focus on history and focused my master's thesis specifically on the Watertown Treaty of 1776 and how that treaty relates to the issue of unceded Wolastoqey territory in Aroostook County, Maine. My connection to this treaty goes a lot deeper, though. I am proud of my education in the university setting, but the bulk of my knowledge, and I believe the most significant of my knowledge, has come from living and working within my Wolastoqey communities. I've had the opportunity to sit and listen to elders teach about treaty history in my home community of Metaksonekiyik, or the Houlton Band of Maliseets, and Welamukotuk, Oromocto First Nation, and Ma'kmaq First Nation. When I was in my mid-20s, I also worked for Welamukotuk and Zeke First Nations in resource development consultation in New Brunswick. I had the opportunity to watch as our First Nation governments in Canada advocated for and practiced their treaty rights on a provincial and national level. For Wabanaki people, treaties are not just an aspect of history. They are international agreements which should bear legal consequences today. My elders taught me about treaty history to empower me with pride in who I am as a Wabanaki person, but to also help me navigate our current world. Today I serve as a tribal ambassador for the Houlton Band of Maliseets. My job is to advocate on behalf of my tribal government with the state of Maine and American federal government. The Houlton Band of Maliseets is the only Wolastoqey community here on this side of the border with Canada. There are 7 other Wolastoqey communities in Canada. We are all part of one larger nation, but each of our communities are politically distinct and exercise independent sovereignty. This, this map that I have up here might seem very unfamiliar, but that's part of the reason why I like it. It's oriented backwards compared to what I think most people in Maine are used to. As you can see, top left corner is Portland and bottom right corner is New Brunswick. This is all of the locations of our reservations, our First Nations. Right in the middle of it, you can see the Houlton Band of Maliseets Indians. I like this orientation because oftentimes when we look at a map of Maine, you see this one tiny little dot of Houlton right at the very tip of the state. We look like out in the middle of nowhere, but from our perspective, it's not the middle of nowhere. It's actually in the heartland of our territory. Our traditional territory is the Wolastoqey River watershed, which is the St. John River in English, and it extends from the St. Lawrence River out to the Atlantic Ocean. And much of that territory is in Aroostook County, Maine. I wish I could have a pointer or something, but it's that very large green area to the left of Wabanaki Maliseet First Nation there. Also, I think it's important to note, Wolastoqey is the traditional name of the Maliseet people. One is in the language, the other is not. As a nation, we are in the process of reclaiming our traditional name. In English, Wolastoqey means the people of the river. It is a reference to our homeland along the Wolastoq, or in English, the St. John River. The Watertown Treaty was signed on July 19, 1776. It was a moment which occurred early in the American Revolution. In fact, the treaty was signed just 2 weeks after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I think a point which is often forgotten in American history is that although some of the British North American colonies joined the Revolution, not all of them did. The colony of Massachusetts did, for instance, yet the colony of Nova Scotia did not. Massachusetts and the other states who joined the Continental Congress worked hard to tempt Nova Scotia colonists into rebellion. The Wabanaki nations were caught between these two forces. This is the atmosphere in which the newly formed United States reached out to the Wabanaki nations to sign a treaty. So to truly understand this moment in time, we need to examine this history from all perspectives. The perspective of the United States and the state of Massachusetts, the British Crown and the colony of Nova Scotia, and from the perspective of the Wabanaki nations. For a quick overview of geography to help set the late 18th century stage in the Atlantic Maritimes and northeastern United States, the current landmass of Maine at the time of the American Revolution was claimed by the British colony of Massachusetts Bay. The Massachusetts colonial charter granted by the British Crown extended from the city of Boston to the St. Lawrence River in modern-day Quebec. I say this land was claimed and not owned, occupied, or conquered because there was in fact very little settler presence in most of this territory. Although the territory from Boston to the St. Lawrence River might have been claimed by Massachusetts, most of the territory had not been settled by British settlers. Most of this territory had not even been explored by British settlers. British claim to space in the 18th century period of overseas colonial expansion did not rely on occupation or physical control over territory. Instead, they relied on diplomatic treaties with other European nations, and importantly, they relied on treaties with Indigenous nations. Throughout most of the world history, the traditional means of expanding national lines happened through the physical act of conquest. Armies marching to conquer other armies, governments created to govern the inhabitants of the conquered land. In the era of European overseas colonial expansion, this changed. During this era, land was not conquered through physical occupation and control over territory, but often through diplomacy and treaties signed between European nations to divide space without either nation having seen or visited the lands that they claimed to own. And importantly, the colonial governments established to govern this colonial territory were created to govern colonists, not the Indigenous people. Despite living side by side with these colonies, Indigenous people remained governed by themselves. The infamous line, "merciless Indian savages" in the Declaration of Independence is an example of what I mean. In the American Revolution, the members of the Continental Congress did not create a government which intended to govern Indigenous people. That can be a dark thing to say today, and certainly this mentality led to some dark history in the years that followed. Yet this mentality also hinted at significant truth. Throughout this period, Indigenous people governed themselves within their own national governments and within their own legal jurisdictions. Our interpretations and understandings of treaty history from this period must keep that in mind. And importantly, if we are ever attempt to settle any of these treaties, the resulting relationship must do justice to this original intention. I grew up learning treaty history from my elders. It was the only place I can get that information. The public education I received in the United States barely covered that topic at all. Yet within Wabanaki communities across the state and across the Atlantic Maritime, the stories surrounding our treaties are vitally important. The story I learned growing up was one of sovereignty. I learned that the first treaties the Wolastoqey and Nation signed were with the other Wabanaki nations long before European contact. The Wabanaki Confederacy itself, as an example, is a treaty relationship. Treaties were a long-established legal tradition in Wabanaki culture and society that predates European arrival. When Europeans did come, we entered treaty relationships with them as well. Yet throughout all these treaty relationships, whether those relationships were between other tribal nations or with these European newcomers, we approached the formation of treaties from within our own understanding of concepts like law and sovereignty, and through our own political and legal methodologies. If we want to do justice to this history today, we must make an intentional effort to conceptualize these agreements not just through the lens of 18th century European international diplomatic protocols, but through indigenous protocols and indigenous methodologies as well. It was this Wabanaki perspective that I and many other Wabanaki people learned growing up. I learned that we have never ceded our land, rights, and sovereignty from our perspective. That is a simple statement and a simple concept, but spend any time learning this history from a colonial perspective, and you will find that statement refuted almost immediately. For many European or American perspectives, the very point of a treaty was to claim land and cede rights. From our perspective, that is not what a treaty is. It is not about domination or control. A treaty is a relationship. The very act of entering a relationship with another being or with another nation is to recognize another's sovereignty and their inherent right to make decisions for themselves. It is also the acknowledgement of your own responsibility to honor the relationship you form together. This relationship is not just created between people or mass groups of people. It can and must also be created between people and animate and inanimate life. We have a responsibility to maintain a healthy relationship with our lands and waters, plants and animals. We form treaty relationships with all of them. Each of these entities have sovereignty and a right to exist by their own terms. I learned to conceptualize treaties in this way, then was thrown into a colonial education system that taught something else entirely. That sought to teach treaty history, yet struggled to conceptualize the fundamental elements of this perspective and worldview. Compounding that is 2 centuries worth of law meant to help navigate Wabanaki American or Wabanaki British relations. This law is built upon an understanding of history colored by what each nation needed out of those relationships. Whether you are in Canada or in the United States, the story you might learn about this history changes dramatically. The primary reason for this is because treaties are a form of international law. How these nations have chosen to incorporate treaties into their contemporary legal code or refuse to incorporate treaties into their law differs dramatically. As such, the stories we tell ourselves about this history changes depending on which country you are in. First, if you are from Maine, it is likely you never heard about the Watertown Treaty of 1776. The story we tell of the American Revolution here in American schools rarely mentions any treaty history. We might learn about the Stamp Act. We might learn about no taxation without representation. We learn about injustices at the hands of the British Crown and colonists revolting against it. In Canada, the story is slightly different. There they teach of things like the Rural Proclamation of 1763. Here in the United States, what we learn about the Rural Proclamation is usually just the proclamation line. In 1763, the British Crown and Privy Council drew a line down the Appalachian mountain range and forbade any colonists from surveying or buying any of the land across that line. From the British perspective, or at least from the national myths they tell of their own history, this line was drawn to honor treaties signed with Native nations. The national myths, they tell themselves, emphasizes the British sense of the importance of the rule of law. As a Native person, however, who has focused his research on the many occasions when the importance of the rule of law was set aside for convenience's sake, I would argue that the Royal Proclamation and the Proclamation line was due far more to the cost of colonialism and the result of already costly wars with European rivals at the time. Yet, out of those national myths has come a space to teach and educate on treaty history. From a contemporary Canadian perspective, a main reason why the colonists rebelled against the Crown in the Revolution was because the colonists did not want to honor Native treaties. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 had also established a law which declared that only the Crown had the authority to negotiate treaties with Native nations. The colonies themselves did not have the power to renegotiate the terms of these treaties or create new treaties. As such, Native treaties are an essential element of the history of the British colonies in North America and a common subject in Canadian education today. I think it is very telling that treaty history is rarely taught here in the United States. This narrative does not fit within the United States' own national myths of the Revolution. As a student educated in the American public education system, this change in perspective was eye-opening, of course, but it was still not the story I learned growing up. In Metaksonekiyik, I learned about the Watertown Treaty of 1776. With my family in New Brunswick, I learned of the Peace and Friendship Treaties of 1725 to 1778. What I learned was that each of these treaties, whether they were signed with the United States or Great Britain, were expressions of our sovereign nationhood. They were mutual recognitions of that sovereignty. They were signed for specific 18th century reasons, such as the Watertown Treaty, which was a military alliance during the American Revolution, but they were also the mutual recognition that these nations had the authority to sign agreements and govern their own people in their own lands. It was the acknowledgement that there were more governments governing people within North American territory than just the United States and Great Britain. Whether I studied in Maine or New Brunswick, our history was never presented in this way. Instead, the history of the Watertown Treaty was presented as almost a tug of war between the United States and Great Britain. From our perspective, the treaties were proof of our sovereignty and independence. Yet from either the American or Canadian perspective, they were proof that we sided with either one side or the other. And each side has used this history to reinforce their own national myths on this land. From the perspective of the British, the story of the Watertown Treaty is, first off, rarely told, but when it is told, the story begins far earlier than the American Revolution. It begins in 1725, where the first treaty the British signed with the Wabanaki Nations. The Wabanaki Nations, as a united confederacy, negotiated a treaty of peace and friendship in 1725, and the nations continually renewed that relationship throughout the 18th century. That is the picture of the treaty on the wall there. It's known today as the Mascarenes Treaty or the Treaty of Boston. This was a historical reenacting of the signing. On the bottom, you can see all the chiefs from the Wolastoqey Nation at the time. Houlton Band's there and Chief Branded Commander at the time. This was 2016. In this first peace and friendship treaty, the Wabanaki nations agreed to lay down their arms and stop attacking British settlements. The British agreed to stop expanding into sovereign Wabanaki territory and to no longer impact Wabanaki hunting, fishing, fowling, and planting territories. This is how the story is told today, but for 2 centuries following the signing of this agreement, the British government told a very different story. In the story they told, the Treaty of 1725 was a full and total submission by the Wabanaki nations to the British Crown. All of the Wabanaki nations, by the way. It was not until 1999 that a series of court decisions in the Canadian Supreme Court finally changed that narrative. The first Marshall decision ruled that the peace and friendship treaties are still valid forces in Canadian law today. The court ruled that they are not land cession treaties, but relationship building treaties. They weren't intended to end a people or end their claim to rights and land, but intended to create a relationship, which must be maintained today. A lot of work went into proving that the peace and friendship treaties created rights for Wabanaki people, and proving that the Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq First Nations are the modern-day recipients of these rights. The generations of my parents and grandparents fought and bled for the recognition of these rights. Today, people throughout the province learn about each one of the peace and friendship treaties. Yet in this education, there is very little acknowledgement or understanding of the Watertown Treaty. In our fight to claim rights deriving from the peace and friendship treaty relationship with the British Crown, there was little incentive to highlight the moment in time when we allied with the United States against the Crown in the American Revolution. From the British and Canadian perspective, the Watertown Treaty of 1776 is often framed as just a brief lapse in Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq loyalty to the Crown. From their perspective, during the American Revolution, the Wabanaki Nations briefly considered an alliance with the rebel colonists, then reconsidered and returned to the side of the British. 2 years after the Wolastoqey Nation signed the Watertown Treaty and entered a treaty relationship with the newly formed United States, they also signed a treaty with the British Crown, remembered as the Treaty of Fort Howe of 1778. In this treaty, the Wolastoqey renewed the treaty relationship with the Crown established in the peace and friendship treaties. From the Canadian perspective today, this is the end of the relevancy of the Watertown Treaty and the brief American-Wolastoqey alliance. To highlight this point, these are the words engraved on a plaque located in St. John, New Brunswick, which commemorates the signing of the Treaty of Fort Howe in 1778. This plaque is there to this day, if anyone wants to visit. It briefly explains the signing of the Treaty of 1778 at Fort Howe and ends with the line, "The treaty did much to ensure the loyalty of the Indians despite continued American overtures during the Revolutionary War." For those of you who might already have some grounding in the history from an American perspective, I'm sure you are immediately aware that this is not how the story is told here in the United States. Here in Maine, the story is told a little different. From an American perspective, the Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq were America's first allies in the American Revolution. The Watertown Treaty was signed just 2 weeks after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It was the very first exercise of American sovereign authority to break the British Royal Proclamation of 1763 and negotiate directly with Native nations, something that was explicitly forbidden under the Royal Proclamation. The Watertown Treaty was also the first international treaty the United States ever signed. The treaty itself is directly tied to the Declaration of Independence. The first half of the treaty opens with the same words as the Declaration, declaring that, quote, "These united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states." The full declaration was read aloud from the balcony of the Edmund Fowle House in Watertown, Massachusetts, following the treaty conference. From the perspective of an American historian, and perhaps anyone who loves American Revolutionary War history, this was an exciting saga in American history, a saga which naturally concluded with the crescendo of military engagement as Wabanaki warriors fought alongside American Continental Army soldiers in battles such as the Siege of Fort Cumberland in 1776 or the Battle of Machias in 1777. I understand the temptation to revel in this history without peeking ahead to the later chapters. I think for those of you who are looking for a patriotic story, it is here where I should just stop talking. It has always been very tempting to do exactly that. As a political representative for my people, I understand the temptation to use the narrative that best fits your agenda. If our goal is to secure rights within the United States, then perhaps I should allow the patriotic narrative to dominate. But the history here is far more complicated than that. Following these exciting years of military history and the formation of these international alliances came 2 centuries worth of broken treaties and the forced land dispossession of thousands of Wabanaki people. Whether those Wabanaki people were in Canada or the United States, whether they chose to fight for one side or the other, the outcome was the same. In recent years, in my role as tribal ambassador, I have watched Maine state legislators stand on the floor of the House or the Senate in Augusta and proudly share the history of the Watertown Treaty and proudly proclaim that the Watertown Treaty is proof that America's first allies with the Wabanaki people. They share phrases like, "If the Wabanaki people did not fight for the American cause, the northern border of the United States might look very different today." That's true. They share that the Wabanaki were the very first people to recognize the sovereignty of the United States. And it is for that reason that Wabanaki people deserve rights today. That is the reason we deserve rights today. It's hard to explain the mix of emotions I feel when I've heard these words. On one hand, it's gratifying that some education on the topic is starting to permeate through Maine public consciousness. That is a wonderful thing. And it's wonderful that there are spaces like here today where people are reaching out to Wabanaki people to hear our side of the story. I grew up feeling empowered to share our treaty history, but the more I learned, the more it felt like my people and my nation were forced to walk a tightrope between the competing narratives of the United States and Canada. In New Brunswick, our people are forced to walk a similar line to gain our rights within Canadian law there. Growing up on the border between these two nations, it seemed clear to me that this divide between narratives hinted at a significant truth, that each of these nations have used our history to further their own goals. What is missing is a story told from a Wabanaki perspective. That is a story I will attempt to share today, specifically the story through the eyes of a Wolastoqey person. What follows is the history of the signing of the Watertown Treaty. A key point I want to emphasize is that in each of our interactions with either the state of Massachusetts, the colony of Nova Scotia, the Second Continental Congress, or the British Crown, we acted as a sovereign nation pursuing our own interests. Within a contemporary context, as we pursue rights within American or Canadian systems, we are often forced to emphasize our relationship with one side or another. This is the story told for our own sake, from our perspective. In 1775, Massachusetts reached out to the Wabanaki nations for help in their rebellion against the British Crown. One of their primary motivations was to convince the colonists in Nova Scotia to join their rebellion. This would divert British forces to Nova Scotia and potentially alleviate some of the forces Washington and the Continental Army were facing in hard-fought lands such as in New York and Massachusetts. Washington, Massachusetts, and Nova Scotia all knew that most of the territory between the colonies in Nova Scotia and Massachusetts was primarily occupied and controlled by Wabanaki people. The limited British settlers in these areas lived in constant fear that the Wabanaki nations would break the tentative peace in the region resulting from the peace and friendship treaties. These Wabanaki nations could easily destroy these isolated settlements. Washington and Massachusetts believed that a treaty with these Wabanaki nations to join them in their war against the British Crown might scare enough Nova Scotia settlers into siding with the Revolution. In fact, the strategy was to a certain extent successful. In 1775, after repeated meetings with Washington and the creation of friendly relations, warriors from the Wolastoqey Nation raided and destroyed the British settlement of Majorville along the Wolastoq. Immediately following this attack, the British citizens of Majorville reached out to Washington and declared their support for the Revolution. Likely they felt they had no other option. It is here in this story I'd like to pause and shift perspective. Majorville was not a random target, and the Wolastoqey Nation did not target Majorville simply out of loyalty to Washington or Massachusetts. The Wolastoqey Nation had harbored a long history of anger toward the settlement at Majorville. First, because they believed the settlement was built on unceded and unsurrendered land. In 1762, when British settlers first journeyed up the Wolastoq to survey a potential new settlement site, they were met by a large company of Wolastoqey warriors who warned them away, saying that they were trespassers and, quote, the country belonged to them, and unless they retired immediately, they would compel them to do so. Despite this warning, however, the surveyors surveyed the land, and a few years later, settlers arrived determined to build a settlement in the area. This settlement was an immediate source of tension between the Wolastoqey Nation and the colonists from Nova Scotia. This is but one example of the abuse of the people of the Wolastoqey Nation felt was happening to them at the hands of the British Crown and the royal colonial officials from Nova Scotia. Majorville was but one settlement, and the Wolastoqey Nation had dealt with repeated insults of that matter throughout the early to mid-18th century. From their perspective, in 1725, in the First Peace and Friendship Treaty, the British Crown had promised not to encroach on Wabanaki sovereign territory, provided the Wabanaki stop attacking the already established British settlements. From the Wabanaki perspective, each new British settlement that was created following this agreement broke the terms of that treaty. Despite this treaty, the British expanded relentlessly into sovereign Wabanaki territory. In the 1750s, the Wolastoqey Nation once again declared war on Great Britain in a conflict remembered in American history textbooks as the French and Indian War. This history is rarely told from a Wabanaki perspective in American classrooms, but from our perspective, we did not go to war to advance France's interests. We allied with the French to pursue our own grievances with the British. They had broken the peace treaty and created settlements in sovereign Wabanaki territory. In 1760, following the end of the French and Indian War, we once again agreed on a peace treaty. This treaty has been remembered as the Peace and Friendship Treaty of 1760. Each Wabanaki nation had their own treaty relationship on their own terms. This treaty was between the Wolastoqey Nation, the Passamaquoddy Nation, and the British Crown, and mainly reconfirmed the original tenets of the Peace and Friendship Treaty relationship established in 1725. This treaty also included a trade agreement. In this agreement, the British Crown outlined their plan to create a system of truck houses to trade provisions for furs with the people of the Wabanaki nations. The traders in these truck houses would honor a fixed price table for these furs, and Nova Scotia colonial officials would ensure that only traders licensed by the colony could trade with the Wabanaki. This would, in effect, allow Nova Scotia to control pricing in these truck houses. In exchange for this, the Wolastoqey and Passamaquoddy agreed to no longer attack British settlements. Only 2 years later, in 1762, Nova Scotia broke this promise and sent surveyors to map the area which would eventually become Majorville. A year later, in 1763, the trade agreement established in the Treaty of 1760 would also be broken. In the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the British Crown and Privy Councillors declared that in the Treaty of 1760, the colony of Nova Scotia had created for themselves an inappropriate monopoly of all the trade with the Wabanaki nations, and declared that any traders could enter the area and trade, provided they received a rural license from them to do so. The effect of this proclamation was that the area was flooded with new traders who did not follow the agreed-upon price table for furs. This had, in effect, changed the terms of the Treaty of 1760. Yet none of this received consent from any of the Wabanaki nations. One of these new traders was a man named John Anderson. He established a truck house in the settlement of Majorville. In the decades following the establishment of Majorville and these new truck houses following the Royal Proclamation of 1763, Wolastoqey people shared repeated complaints about abuses at the hands of men like John Anderson and other traders, such as the well-known trading partners of Simmons, Hazen, and White. In 1775, when Wolastoqey warriors finally attacked and raided the town of Majorville, John Anderson's trading post was raided, the goods carried off, and Anderson himself held captive and delivered to the Continental Army. Up on the screen now is a reference to Anderson in the minutes of the negotiations leading up to the signing of the Watertown Treaty. During the treaty negotiations, Chief Ambrose Bear from the Wolastoqey Nation explained that Anderson had attempted to convince the Wolastoqey to join the side of England and issued to them a threat should they take any money from the Boston men. Ambrose explained that they took the sword from him, set him as a mark, and despised him. What he seemed to leave out was that they also raided his truck house. Following their attack on Majorville, the Wolastoqey Nation chose to boycott all Nova Scotia-operated truck houses and instead travel the considerable distance to nearby Passamaquoddy territory and trade out of the Massachusetts-funded and operated truck house in Machias. The combined trade from the Wolastoqey, Passamaquoddy, and Mi'kmaq traders journeying to Machias to trade goods for furs quickly overwhelmed the Machias truck house operator, a man named Stephen Smith. Smith wrote a letter to Massachusetts General Court and explained that he simply did not have enough supplies to meet the demand and asked for more goods. He sent this letter via a courier named Captain John Lane, and with Captain Lane traveled 10 Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq diplomats. These 10 Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq diplomats would arrive in Watertown and meet with the Massachusetts Provincial Congress over the course of 2 weeks, which would culminate in the signing of a Treaty of Alliance and Friendship remembered today as the Watertown Treaty of 1776. One of my first pursuits when I began researching the Watertown Treaty was combing through the minutes of the treaty negotiations. For anyone interested in learning more about this treaty, I highly suggest reading those minutes for yourself. In the world of treaty research, it is rare that we can read such a detailed account of a treaty negotiation. It's a fascinating peek into a cross-cultural interaction from 250 years ago. And it is a cross-cultural interaction. If you do read them for yourselves, it's important you keep that in mind. Not only were there considerable cultural differences on display, but the entire negotiating process needed to be translated. None of the Wabanaki attendees of the negotiations spoke English. The negotiations occurred through a translator who spoke French. The Wabanaki delegation relied on a single Mi'kmaq man who also spoke French. The full minutes are available on the website for the Watertown Historical Society, for anyone interested. According to the minutes, the Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq delegation arrived at the Edmund Fowle House in Watertown, Massachusetts on July 11, 1776, where they were met by the Massachusetts General Court. In that first meeting, the delegates introduced themselves and the court read aloud the letter from Stephen Smith. The meeting did not begin as a treaty negotiation. It began as just a meeting to request more supplies to be available at the truck house in Machias. It was also not the first such meeting. Over the past year, from the Wolastoqey Nation's perspective, there had been 3 prior times when Wolastoqey national leadership traveled to Massachusetts to meet with American representatives. General George Washington and representatives from Massachusetts had exerted effort throughout the past year to create a positive relationship with the Wabanaki Nations. The first Wabanaki Nation to enter a treaty with Massachusetts was the Penobscot Nation. In 1775, the Penobscot Nation had signed a treaty with the state of Massachusetts, remembered today as the Penobscot Resolve of 1775. I have also heard it referred to as the Watertown Treaty of 1775. That is an excerpt from it is up on the screen now. In this treaty, the Penobscot agreed to fight alongside the Americans in the Battle of the American Revolution, and Massachusetts agreed not to impact Penobscot claim to land along the Penobscot River 6 miles on either side of the river, upriver from the head of the tide. They promised not to settle the lands upriver from the current location of the town of Vesey. They would go on to, of course, break this treaty almost immediately. When the Penobscot filed a formal complaint, Massachusetts representatives argued that in the Penobscot Resolve they had merely acknowledged that the Penobscots had a claim without passing judgment on the validity of that claim. Therefore, they argued, they were free to sell property within Penobscot sovereign territory. That was a shameful moment in American history, and it was only just the beginning. Yet, in 1775, neither the Penobscot nor the Wolastoqey could have guessed this would be the outcome of an alliance with the United States. The Penobscot Resolve of 1775 probably seemed quite favorable in comparison to the promises on behalf of the British and Nova Scotia, who had already proven to not respect Wabanaki sovereign territory. Massachusetts, under this new rebel leadership, was an unknown and might potentially be better allies. In response to letters sent by Massachusetts and General George Washington, delegations from the Penobscot Nation, the Wolastoqey Nation, and the Passamaquoddy Nation all took trips down to Massachusetts to inquire into what a potential alliance with the United States might look like. From my research, it does not seem as if a delegation from the Mi'kmaq Nation ever officially made the trip down. I believe their first meeting in Massachusetts did not happen until the Treaty of Watertown in July 1776. The delegation of Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq representatives journeyed to Watertown in 1776 with the specific reason to navigate the truck house crisis and Machias and request that Massachusetts resupply the truck house with more provisions. This was the original reason why the delegation was there, and from my understanding, the only goal of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress as well. Yet, on day 2, following the delegation's arrival, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress received a new letter from Washington. In this letter, Washington explained that he had requested the Second Continental Congress and received approval to raise a company of soldiers from what he termed the Eastern Indians, or more accurately, the Wabanaki Nations. Washington requested Massachusetts' help in negotiating a new treaty with the Wabanaki and securing a company of Wabanaki warriors to march to join the Continental Army stationed in New York. After receiving this letter, the goal of the Massachusetts General Court changed. What began as a meeting to navigate the specific issue of the truck house at Machias became a plea on behalf of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress for Wabanaki soldiers to aid them in the revolution. The timing of this letter is significant. As I mentioned before, there were well-established Wabanaki protocols concerning how treaties should be signed and the appropriate individuals who are empowered to negotiate on behalf of the entire nation. These protocols long predate the arrival of Europeans. Usually, when considering a new treaty, a consensus vote would be cast between representatives from each settlement and an individual specifically chosen to communicate this decision in treaty negotiations. Oftentimes, this individual was a chief, but not always. The delegation from the Wolastoqey Nation and the Mi'kmaq Nation had not gone through these protocols to speak on behalf of their entire nations. During the treaty negotiations, the lead spokesperson on behalf of the Wabanaki delegation, Chief Ambrose Bear, explained as much. He explained that he personally was willing to fight, and many of the individuals who had journeyed to Watertown with him were willing to depart at once to fight. But he could not speak for the entire nation until his return home. Presumably, once at home, they would need to form a national consensus decision. This is part of the story that gets a little complicated, despite what seems to me a pretty clear explanation that the delegation could not speak on behalf of the entire nation. The resultant English-only treaty indicated exactly that. It indicated the St. John's and Mi'kmaq tribes were wholly ready to fight against the British Crown and would henceforth break all ties and all treaties with the British Crown. On the part of Massachusetts, their only concession was that they promised to resupply the truck house at Machias. I mentioned the negotiations were conducted in French using a translator. To my knowledge, there was no translation offered to the Wabanaki delegation after the treaty's completion. The actual wording of the document itself was likely not fully understood until the delegates returned home. On the screen now is a short excerpt from a conversation that Colonel John Allen recorded in his journal. Following the signing of the Watertown Treaty and the lack of 600 warriors traveling down to New York to supplement the Continental Army, the Continental Congress tasked Colonel John Allen to travel to Mi'kmaq territory and find out what went wrong. There, the men who were present at the treaty signing explained that during the treaty negotiations that they had been imposed on and had signed things not read to them. One also noted that I don't believe they intended to impose on us, but as I was the only interpreter, I believe we did not understand one another. It was possible that there was some miscommunication that occurred in the translation process. It is also possible that this miscommunication was intentional. Once word reached Halifax that the Mi'kmaq had declared war, Halifax officials, probably rightfully, went into a panic. Forces and supplies were diverted to the region in preparation for a possible attack from the very powerful Mi'kmaq Nation next door. It is possible this was Massachusetts' intended goal. Again, however, it is also possible it was a harmless miscommunication. Regardless, once word returned to the Mi'kmaq Nation that a treaty had been signed in their name declaring war against Great Britain, a coalition of all 12 Mi'kmaq chiefs collectively signed a letter delivered to Halifax and Boston. In the letter, the chiefs explained, "A few days ago, an alarm was spread among us that another paper was come to require us to take up the hatchet. We met thereupon and found that some of our young men had been with you in the character of chiefs and made a treaty to go to war, contrary to our desire, and as we understand from them, was not rightly understood." In short, the Mi'kmaq chiefs explained that they had not given their consent to the Watertown Treaty. It had not followed proper protocols, and they were therefore necessitated to return it. Yet they assured Massachusetts at the same time that the chain of friendship is still subsisting between them, and they hope forever. A few months following this letter, the Second Continental Army sent Colonel John Allen to Nova Scotia to meet with the Mi'kmaq chiefs and find out what went wrong. Allen kept a very detailed journal during his travels and sent letters back to Congress describing his diplomatic trip. Allen explained that he managed to receive an invite to attend a meeting with all the Mi'kmaq chiefs and to hear their explanation from them. In short, the chiefs explained that the young men had journeyed to Watertown in July, had done so to find out if it might be likely that Massachusetts might expand their trading efforts closer to Nova Scotia. They were primarily interested in a trade agreement. They had not intended to sign a treaty to go to war, and they did not have the authority to sign a war treaty on behalf of the entire Mi'kmaq Nation. The chiefs also explained that should their warriors leave and travel to New York to fight alongside Washington, the British in Nova Scotia would raid their homes and villages. They explained that they could not leave them unprotected. The Mi'kmaq Nation would prove true to their word and remain neutral as a national body throughout the remainder of the Revolutionary War. Although it should be noted that some Mi'kmaq warriors did fight, but they did so as individuals. The nation chose the path of neutrality. The legal historian James Sakesh Henderson calls the Watertown Treaty the One Heart Treaty. He explains that the treaty might not have created a military alliance as intended, but it was a moment of international recognition and respect between the United States and the Mi'kmaq Nation. In a century since, Mi'kmaq leadership has traveled down to Massachusetts and reconfirmed that this relationship remains strong to this day. Back in the 18th century, the Wolastoqey Nation, however, was in a different situation. As I mentioned earlier, prior to the delegation's journey to Watertown, the nation had already made the national policy decision to attack the British settlement at Majorville, and had already begun to boycott Nova Scotia truck houses in favor of the Massachusetts truck house in Machias. The Mi'kmaq Nation might not have been willing to go to war, but the Wolastoqey Nation were. Yet, they too had complaints about the Watertown Treaty. In a letter to the Massachusetts General Court, Colonel John Allen explained that Chief Ambrose Bear had communicated to him that, quote, the treaty entered into is not punctually fulfilled on the side of the states, that the goods are charged very high, but low prices allowed for their furs. According to Chief Bear, who was present at the treaty negotiations, he was under the impression that the treaty established a price agreement on furs traded out of the Machias truck house. The English wording of the treaty makes no mention of any promised prices in the truck house. Yet, during the treaty minutes itself, John Bowdoin, president of the Massachusetts General Court, had verbally promised to supply the Wabanaki nations with prices, quote, at the same rate they cost us, and allow you from the skins and furs the same price they will fetch in Boston. In response to this promise, Chief Bear, on behalf of the rest of the delegation, had enthusiastically responded, "We like it well," indicating that he considered the trade agreement a good one. And likely, if Massachusetts had fulfilled that promise, the rest of the Wabanaki nations would have also considered it a great deal. Abuses at the hands of private traders were a primary reason why some of the Wabanaki nations were considering a new treaty with the United States in the first place. Following his unsuccessful trip to visit the Mi'kmaq Nation, the Continental Congress once again mobilized Colonel John Allen, this time to the Wolastoqey Nation, to find out from them what happened with the Watertown Treaty and why a regiment of Wolastoqey warriors did not march to New York as the treaty had declared. Prior to his voyage, Allen knew the Wolastoqey Nation's main grievance with the treaty was Chief Bear's conveyance concerning the lack of fixed pricing in Machias truck house, and the Mi'kmaq Nation's concern that Nova Scotia would attack their settlements should they leave them undefended was likely also a significant concern. Over the course of nearly a month, June 5th to 23rd, 1777, Wolastoqey and Passamaquoddy representatives negotiated a new treaty with Colonel John Allen at the Wolastoqey settlement of Ekpahak. This treaty has been remembered as the Passamaquoddy and Wolastoqey Treaty of 1777, or sometimes as the Ekpahak Treaty of 1777. Historians' relative lack of engagement with the terms of the Passamaquoddy and Wolastoqey Treaty of 1777 is owing in considerable part to historical actors' failure or inability to maintain their own records. The text of this treaty has not been preserved. Nevertheless, in the absence of these original documents, Allen's letters to Congress, and importantly Allen's own secretary's account of Allen's actions during the campaign, shed light on the likely contents of this treaty. The likely terms of the treaty was a fixed price table for furs traded out of the truck house in Machias, in exchange for Wolastoqey and Passamaquoddy military assistance in the Revolutionary War, provided that military assistance remain within the limits of Wabanaki territory, instead of a march to New York, as suggested in the Watertown Treaty. Although John Allen signed the treaty, and the treaty was ratified by the Wolastoqey and Passamaquoddy nations, the Continental Congress did not ratify the Passamaquoddy and Wolastoqey Treaty of 1777. Evidence suggests that Allen, as a colonel in the Continental Army and representative of the Continental Congress, did not have the power or the authority to promise fixed prices in a Massachusetts-funded and operated truck house. That power remained in the hands of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. In his communication to the Continental Congress, Allen carefully avoided the details of this treaty, instead characterizing the Wolastoqey and Passamaquoddy nations' choices to ally themselves with the Continental Army as loyalty or allegiance to the American cause. Following this treaty conference at Ekpahak, Wolastoqey warriors journeyed alongside Colonel John Allen to nearby Passamaquoddy territory, and Wolastoqey and Passamaquoddy warriors fought alongside the Continental Army in the town of Machias against an attempted British landing and occupation of that town, in a battle remembered as the Battle of Machias of 1777. Without an understanding of the terms of the Passamaquoddy and Wolastoqey Treaty of 1777, American historians have often colored this action as proof of Allen's control over the Wolastoqey and Passamaquoddy, or their passionate support for the American Revolutionary cause. Although the evidence of Wolastoqey and Passamaquoddy military assistance in this conflict cannot be hidden, the lack of transparency in the American treaty obligations towards the nations in return for this assistance has contributed to the false understanding that the United States did not sign any new treaty obligations. This, in turn, has contributed to the inaccurate narrative that the Wolastoqey Nation's choice to sign a new agreement with the British Crown a year later was part of their loyalty or allegiance switching once again, despite the evidence of repeated Wolastoqey sentiment that the promised truck house prices were not honored and the American signed treaties broken. On September 24th, 1777, the Wolastoqey Nation signed the Treaty of Fort Howe, with the British Crown reconfirming the original tenets of the Peace and Friendship Treaty relationship. From the perspective of the Wolastoqey, each of these instances of international diplomacy were concluded for their own ends, namely, to situate themselves in the most advantageous position they continue to govern themselves. By the close of the American Revolution, the Wolastoqey Nation had demonstrated by action and by treaty their intention to remain a sovereign and independent state, not beholden to either colonial nation and free to govern their own people within their own legal jurisdiction. Each of the Wabanaki nations were in a similar position and held a similar mentality concerning their own sovereignty. This is powerful and empowering history. The story of Wabanaki involvement in the American Revolution, whether they chose to ally with the United States or not, is a story of tribal sovereignty in action. The complex history resulting from the Watertown Treaty had a profound effect on Wolastoqey history in Maine. It contributed to the idea that we are a Canadian tribe, not an American one. This point was argued strongly during the negotiations leading up to the signing of the 1980 Maine Indian Land Claim Settlement Act. Lawyers on behalf of the state argued that the United States did not have a federal trust responsibility for any Wolastoqey people in Maine because the nation had signed agreements with Canada, despite the reality that nearly half of our traditional territory is in what would eventually become the United States and the state of Maine, as if our choice to sign a treaty with the British Crown as well as the United States is an acceptable reason to forcefully dispossess thousands of people. It is not. In 1794 and 1796, Massachusetts signed treaties with the Passamaquoddy and Mi'kmaq Nations. In these treaties, they promised stretches of territory to each nation. These treaties would eventually be litigated heavily during the Maine Indian Land Claim Settlement Act. There is no similar treaty between Massachusetts and the Wolastoqey or Mi'kmaq Nations, despite the existence of the Watertown Treaty. During the negotiations leading up to the signing of the Treaty of 1794, negotiators on behalf of Massachusetts explained why. They shared that there were representatives from the Wolastoqey Nation and Mi'kmaq Nation present at the signing of the Treaty of 1794, and they shared that these representatives shared their continued peace and friendship with the United States. Yet the Massachusetts representatives feared that if they mentioned either the Wolastoqey or Mi'kmaq by name in the treaty, it might renew war with Canada. So instead, the wording of the treaty just states, quote, the Passamaquoddy tribe and other tribes related to them. This is a reference to the Wolastoqey and Mi'kmaq Nations. From our perspective, this was yet another instance of us demonstrating our sovereignty and friendly relations with the United States, which should not be a problem and should not be a reason to deny us rights today. Yet again, another example of this tug of war between the United States and Great Britain and the long-term harm that created. In 1794, most of the territory of the Wolastoqey Valley was not within what Massachusetts considered their territory to negotiate. In the late 18th century, what would eventually become Aroostook County was claimed by both the United States and Great Britain. The eventual international border between the two nations would not be decided until 50 years later, in the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842. When Great Britain ceded their claim to this unceded and unsurrendered territory to the United States in the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, they also ceded the treaty relationship upon which their claim was built. In 1842, and the century following, this treaty relationship and the federal trust responsibility resulting from this relationship was conveniently forgotten. By that time, the era of negotiating indigenous treaties in Maine and the Maritimes was over, even though their own negotiating for territory in the area was clearly not over. In the century following the American Revolution, as the United States and Canada slowly began to settle the Wolastoq Valley and officially draw the international border between them, Wolastoqey people living throughout which would eventually be considered Aroostook County were faced with a decision. Either leave their homes and move on to the reservations established on the Canadian side of the border, where they could gain access to limited resources and limited land, or stay in their homes and face persecution in practicing our seasonal movements and traditional lifeways. A small community of Wolastoqey people helped establish the town of Houlton and settled nearby. The town of Houlton was built on an old Wolastoqey settlement site known as Metaksonekiyik. It was Wolastoqey people who first showed the site to the founders of the town and showed them where to build. In the century which followed, these families would face persecution and more forced displacement as the settlers of Houlton attempted to force them out. In the mid-19th century, the community of Wolastoqey people living along the banks of the Metaksonekiyik River was known colloquially in the town of Houlton as the Indian Reservation. This reservation would move repeatedly from one side of the town to another as prominent figures in the town attempted to force them out. This was the origins of the Houlton Band of Maliseets Indians. Over the years, many families also fled the residential school system in Canada. If you can get your kids over the international border and into Maine, you could keep your kids out of the hands of the RCMP and the Christian churches. This was my family's specific history. My grandmother was in residential school in Wabanaki in Canada. When she had the opportunity to leave, she ran across the border to the United States. Yet there was not an established reservation for Wolastoqey people on this side of the border. Some families ended up in the Passamaquoddy communities or the Penobscot communities. Many more ended up in Houlton. Over time, our community grew, and in 1980, the United States federal government finally recognized the Houlton Band of Maliseets Indians as an official reservation. The history of the Watertown Treaty of 1776 and our decisions during the American Revolution are not the only causes for the forced displacement of Wolastoqey people in Maine. There are many different factors, all of which deserve to be examined, and many of which draw into doubt the characteristics of freedom and justice the United States claims. Yet the Watertown Treaty and the history which followed was a significant moment. To leave you all with some closing words, a couple years ago, I delivered a presentation at a church in Houlton. It was a great opportunity, and I had a great experience. I wrote a presentation on Wolastoqey land dispossession in Aroostook County. I thought it was an opportunity for people to hear some new history from their own neck of the woods. And I was especially gratified that a co-worker was in the crowd that night. He's not native, but he lived in Houlton his entire life and worked for the Houlton Band of Maliseets for years. A few days following my presentation, we had a chance to speak. He shared that he enjoyed it, but was left wondering what's next. Now that we have this history, what did I expect him to do with it? Was I saying he needed to give the land back? No, I'm not saying you need to give the land back. Honestly, I'm not sure how to navigate the complicated political landscape that has resulted from centuries worth of injustice. But what I do know is that it is unacceptable that we do not talk about this history, that we do not teach this history. We do not need to have all the answers, but we must teach the accurate story of our time on this land together. The lasting legacy of the Watertown Treaty should be one of international recognition and respect between friends and allies, the way the relationship was always meant to be. We can only guess what the future has in store. Perhaps new generations might finally craft relationships on this land which fully embody ideas of equality and justice. I personally have a lot of hope for the future. Our future on this land together need not recreate the past, but teaching the accurate history at the core of our relationship can allow us to create something new together. Ideas of Indigenous governance and sovereignty are not a threat to the United States or Canada. They are an opportunity and a potential source for inspiration. Systems of Indigenous governance managed to maintain a balance on this land for over 10,000 years. In contrast, the United States existed for 250. The British Empire existed for around 400. If our countries adopt a truly equal representation of every person on this land, Indigenous ideas of balance, reciprocity, and sovereignty can help us all chart a new future on this land together. Woliwan.